I think it's rare that I get drawn to a game based on the artwork alone, but I really like the work of Fu Sui Chin, more commonly known by her initials FSC. She's a Singapore-based artist who's arguably most well known for the earlier issues of the Nightmare and Fairy Tale comics, which I'm a big fan of. So hearing that she's behind the designs of a video game by Wayforward certainly got my attention. It was a bit of a struggle to keep that attention though. Controller issues and some trial and error based progression put the game at a halfway point between fun and frustrating. Lit has our protagonist Jake attempting to navigate a school entrenched by darkness and roaming with monsters, hoping to eventually escape with his friend Rachel. There's not much of a story here aside from some minor conversations via phone calls. This is one of those games that use the Wii Remote speaker as a phone receiver, which is a little novel. The voice acting's not great, but it's not bad either. The gameplay is a character puzzler, where the player must safely navigate Jake from one end of the room to the exit. Walking on any bit of darkness is an instant death, and forces a restart on the room. As such, figuring out how to illuminate the floor in order to create a safe path is the key to winning the game. This can be done by turning on lamps, shooting slingshot pellets through windows, and operating television remotes, among other things. One of the earlier curveballs the game will throw at you is the limitation that turning on too much electricity at once will blow a fuse, which also causes a game over. So the amount of electricity being used at once needs to be carefully managed. There's a unique boss fight every 6th stage, which twists the base concept a little bit. After a total of 30 stages, the game ends. An optional challenge here is to try and answer every phone call in the game, and doing so awards the player with the good ending and an alternate character to play as. Although both the good and the bad endings are very anemic. I know there wasn't much story to the game in the first place, but even then the endings are really disappointing. After completing the game once, a harder difficulty is unlocked. It's exactly the same as the base game, but now the player has an extremely strict time limit to adhere to, along with the room gradually getting darker. It's essentially a speedrun mode that's forced upon the player. That's about the whole game. There's not much to it, and in traditional Wayforward fashion, it's over rather quickly. My initial playthrough finished at about 4 hours, and subsequent playthroughs for the very minor replay value were done in about half the time. Unfortunately, even for as short as it is, there are quite a few issues with this game that hamper it down. For starters, the controls aren't the greatest. The A button uses items in your inventory as well as interacting with the environment, which can and often does lead to accidentally activating lights when you didn't mean to. Aiming the slingshot in third person is also annoying and really slow. And throwing cherry bombs requires that typical motion control movement that I feel never really works properly. It's fine at first when the game is slower paced and you can take your time, but the later levels require some time-sensitive segments that make it feel like you're wrestling with the controls and you really don't have time for this. The camera, of all things, is a bit of an annoyance too. There are 3 different angles to work with, but none of them are particularly great, and it just makes me wish that I could freely control it. What's worse is every time you pick up an item, the camera quickly zooms in and out. Maybe it's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but it is completely unnecessary and can be a little disorientating when you're picking up multiple items in succession. Overall, the game is just okay. It's a really neat idea, but one that feels like it wasn't fully realized or properly playtested. None of the puzzles are too difficult or obtuse as to require a guide. However, it can feel like trial and error more often than not, and since levels are so short, it's not a bad strategy to just brute force the solutions, rather than really thinking them through. And even though the levels and the game as a whole is so short, it's still annoying and feels extremely cheap to get swallowed by the darkness. The camera isn't the greatest for making sure your footing is accurate, and several of the rooms require very specific placement. Especially for the cherry bombs where you're required to break a window, but not an electronic right next to the window. It's not awful, but it could have and should have been much better. About 6 years after its initial release, Lit was remade from the ground up for mobile platforms, and this version would later be ported to PC. While I haven't played this version, it looks like it's easier to handle and the graphical elements are more clear. Since it's 2D and strictly grid-based, as opposed to 3D, some bits of the gameplay will undoubtedly be lost. But for the most part, it seems like the same idea. And also, since it's grid-based, you're not going to accidentally walk into the darkness. So that little bit of frustration is thankfully alleviated. The original artwork by FSC has been replaced with some generic chibi anime style. But it's not like FSC's art actually got a ton of use in the original game anyway. Which is a pretty big shame because that's what I was here for in the first place. I even beat the game 3 times. Once for each of the 2 endings, and a 3rd time as the additional character. I was hoping to unlock a concept art gallery or something, but the closest thing there is this in-game instruction booklet, so that's pretty disappointing. I wouldn't recommend this game as there's nothing really special about it. If you're a huge fan of character puzzlers and you're looking for something you haven't played yet, then maybe this will interest you. By the same token, this review is kind of pointless, since the WiiWare store has long since shut down. I'm playing a copy that I had purchased long ago. But I suppose if you look hard enough online, then you should be able to find some way of playing this version of the game. And for that aspect, it can be kind of neat to play a piece of lost media. Again though, it's whatever. This game isn't that big of a deal. Thanks for watching my review on Lit.